Well, welcome back. We are deep into week 7 of our course, and we are in the McDowell book today. Um, a very practical book, and I picked it because of that. I felt like we needed some combination of the academic and the pragmatic, especially since this is a course on apologetics and ministry. These chapters are done by people, obviously, that McDowell knows, and the first one is by David Geisler, chapter 7, that we're going to look at today. Geisler is the son of Norm Geisler, a very prominent evangelical theologian in America. Norm has published many books, including a massive book on a dictionary of apologetics that is very helpful. Systematic theology in 4 volumes, many occasional studies, and works in philosophy and ethics. So he's kind of one of those polymaths. He's done books on introduction of the Bible, introduction of the New Testament, and so on. But his son here is obviously working at a more pragmatic kind of approach, and he wants to talk about conversational apologetics. I think the idea here may stem from a book that David Clark wrote a dozen years ago or so called Dialogical Apologetics, and that was a helpful book. I remember reading that and thinking this is something I need to incorporate in my own thinking and practice. And of course, conversational means we don't just show up at a church that we've been invited to or at our own church with a suitcase full of facts and figures and quotes and arguments and books in which we're going to overwhelm people with our knowledge of apologetics. Instead, we should arrive with plenty of material to teach on, but be willing to be flexible and listen to the conversation and then react and respond to that. He uses a term several times in this chapter that I found very interesting. It's the term pre-believer, and it's, I guess, a more positive way of saying unbeliever. It's also a term that sort of has built within it the idea that these people are not believers yet, but I'm about to share the gospel, and I'm hopeful they will become believers. On the other hand, you never know that for sure, and so maybe it's a little overly optimistic, but nonetheless, I'll probably use it from time to time. Practical advice: allow others to surface the truth for themselves, listen to them, and when someone in a class that you're teaching or an evangelistic encounter that you have states something that you know to be categorically wrong, don't necessarily hit them head on, but be oblique, go around the edge and come at them from another angle. And he gives an example of Catholic and Mariology. Build heart bridges to the cross. And this whole notion of bridge building is something we've talked about recently with reference to Van Til's book. And I don't think that he and Van Til are talking about quite the same thing. Remember that Van Til said we have to know where people are and what is important to them and what their worldview is before we can begin to talk to them. So I don't think he's talking about the same thing as common ground. Apologetics light, keep it simple. Many times we come in an apologetics situation and we feel like, okay, I have to give them natural theology. I need 4 quotes from Plato and 4 from Aristotle, and I need to have memorized at least the first half of evidence that demands a verdict. And what he's saying here is, if you've studied apologetics and you've studied the Bible, you have a heart for the gospel, then you're probably well enough equipped to handle most situations with teenagers. And I think that's right. Find agreements, even our disagreements. You don't always have to say no. Think of Paul on Mars Hill. Paul on Mars Hill weaves its way in and out of this book, just like it weaves its way in and out of almost every book that deals with apologetics, because it's the one definitive account in the New Testament of the Apostle Paul facing an unbelieving crowd, the Athenian philosophers. Then 3, practical benefit of changing our approach has a practical benefit for us as well as for others. Chapter 8, storytelling and persuasion. This brings us back to Guinness, who spent a whole book talking about persuasion. And he said, again, and this is kind of like the previous chapter by Geisler, except it moves in a little different direction. he says that sometimes we think of apologetics as an unemotional thing. I like his quote where he says, "I had become a Christian Mr. Spock, preferring syllogism over story, proposition over metaphor, science over symbol, and so on." And a lot of that's personality, but we should recognize that persuasiveness oftentimes comes through story. And again, stories are a big part of Scripture. He has one statement here that I'm not sure if I agree with, where he says that Luke casts Paul as a reflection of Socrates. I've read a lot about Socrates over the years, and I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I think on the point that he's trying to establish, that is true. That Socrates didn't beat up the youth of Athens with his ideas. He would engage them in conversation. He'd let them talk, and then he would take their ideas, and oftentimes in the dialogues of Plato, take them down to what we call a reductio ad absurdum. Follow your idea to the end of the trail, and guess what you wind up with? Something that nobody wants to believe in. So I think that certainly is part of Paul's approach. Chapter 9, Mark Matlock talks about emotional development. There's some really interesting information here that's alluded to earlier, I think in Josh McDowell's chapter, but he gives more data on it in this chapter, and that is the Dartmouth Medical School study that was done in 2003 that indicates that we are really hardwired to connect. Now, we ought to know that, but it's nice to have a scientific study that says it. Hardwired to connect means we need to connect, first of all, at the level of family, bonding with parents and with siblings, but then also in the church context. And oftentimes, and I say this by way of confession to a certain degree, oftentimes we see church as, okay, let's go there and do our thing, and then let's go home. And we go back and do our thing, and we go home. Instead of seeing this as a family gathering. And how can we do as much in the time we have together as a family to build relationships with each other as we absolutely can and need to. And so this is a helpful chapter. There's a couple of other great things later on where he talks about the difference between explicit knowing and implicit knowing. And I would turn your attention to that as an important part of this discussion. Yeah, chapter 10, Alex McFarland's chapter on making apologetics come alive in youth ministry. He wants to say here that apologetics can be fun. And I don't mean fun in a frivolous way. We're not going off to one of those arcade places. That's not that kind of fun. But it can be fun in that it becomes an enjoyable conversation and something that young people look forward to. I want to be a part of that. And I have had the experience where it was that way, and I've had the experience where it wasn't that way. You get some practical suggestions for apologetics with youth, and I think I'm just going to mention a couple of these because you can read. But apologetics must be held, the vision for apologetics must be held by the church leadership. I think he means pastors. And sometimes pastors, I know because I've been a pastor. I've been a youth minister, but that was a long time ago. But I've been a pastor, and sometimes pastors want to sort of set the agenda, and sometimes they don't want youth leaders to do something that's somewhat out of their control. But I think what he's pleading for here is that pastors should do that. Make sure your people know what they're doing. Make sure that they have their heart in the right place, but let them do some things that maybe you would not normally feel comfortable with. Educate students about the importance of apologetics. We can teach this to kids. Educate parents. Present apologetics-oriented messages. I think I may have mentioned already that I've been asked to speak at a church in Alabama a little bit down the line on a Sunday morning, a big church on science and Scripture. And that's it takes a lot of courage for a pastor to invite someone that he doesn't really know. I've taught some of his staff members, but the pastor doesn't know me, and it could be a big flop, and then he would say, we're never going to do that again. Home field advantage. Here he's talking about the home, that apologetics begins there. And that's an interesting thought. Apologetics begins at the home. That's almost a lesson that you could teach to a group of adults. There have been times in my pastoral ministry where I have said to the youth pastor on a Wednesday night, and Wednesday night's usually the province of that youth targeted ministry, I've said, let's swap. You take my adults, I'll take your youth. And that might be a good situation where the youth pastor could come over to the adults and say to them, apologetics begins at home. And this is very, very practical chapter. There's one thing that's very important out of this chapter that I think I just want to take a minute on, and that's the study done by G. Stanley Hall in the early 1900s, who implemented an evolutionary concept into his approach to psychology, in which he talked about segregating people by ages in order for education. And of course, I'm not sure that anybody in church life purposefully read that study and said, aha, this secular psychologist tells us that we should have age segregated education, so let's do that in the church. But we have done that, and I'm familiar with Vodi Bakum, as I'm sure some of you are, and his concerns that has destroyed, to a certain degree, the church's ministry. And destroyed is probably too strong. Vodi tends to be a little strong, but certainly has damaged our ability to be effective as a church. And then again, like the others, he ends with some practical advice. The final chapter by Jason Carlson, I'll not get into the details, but it's a chapter on the resurrection of Christ. I think it's a very helpful chapter, tooled right in the direction of young people, what they can grapple with and what they need to grapple with concerning the resurrection. So, practical advice, ministry advice, as we come down to the end of this course, I think it's entirely appropriate that we focus our attention, at least in part. We do have a Van Til reading left coming up, but at least our attention in part on those areas of practical ministry.